The fire raced through the old wooden hallways. Flames climbed the walls of the Royal Hospital of Granada, and the night sky turned orange and gray. In the street, men and women stood frozen, stepping back from the heat coming from the building. No one dared go inside. No one, except a middle-aged man in simple clothes, who ran in the opposite direction from everyone else. His name was John, and inside there were sick people who could not move on their own. While the crowd watched in disbelief, he disappeared into the smoke and the flames. Those outside held their breath. Seconds seemed like hours. And then, little by little, the patients began to appear at the exit, one by one, carried in the arms of that man who went in and out as if the fire could not stop him. Tradition tells that on that night in Granada, John went through the burning corridors repeatedly, without rest, thinking only of those who depended on someone to survive. According to old biographies, he even reached the roof of the building to separate the wing that was still burning from those that could be saved. But the man who ran to that hospital had not begun life as someone admired by everyone. He had not been raised in a monastery, he did not possess riches, and he was not known for great learning. He had been a shepherd, a soldier, a traveler, a worker of many trades, and a seller of books. He had lived far from home, experienced defeats, carried guilt, and spent years searching for a direction he could not find. Perhaps someone in the crowd wondered why he was doing that. Why would a man risk himself for people who were not his relatives, who might not even know his name? The answer is not in a taste for danger. It is in a discovery that John had taken a lifetime to make. When a human being suffers abandoned, God calls us not to pass by. In that moment, no one could know if John would return. The smoke hid the corridors. The fire seemed to advance ever further, and the sick continued waiting for someone. The night in Granada seemed to tell only a story of fire. But in truth, it was revealing the story of a conversion, the story of how an ordinary man learned to see Christ where others saw only forgotten people. Who was this man? Where did such courage, such self-giving come from? To understand, we need to go back a long way. We need to cross decades and borders and begin where it all began, in a small town in Portugal, at the dawn of a new century. On March 8, 1495, in Montemor-o-Novo, Portugal, a child was born who was given the name John Ciudad. The world in which he opened his eyes was vast and in motion. Portugal was sailing seas never before sailed, and the Iberian Peninsula was living through a time of great transformations, wars, and discoveries that shook the lives of ordinary people everywhere. John grew up in that scene of change, in a humble family, in a country where the Catholic faith shaped the rhythm of days, of feasts and of sorrows. Old biographies record that, around the age of 8, the boy John left Portugal and went to live in Oropesa, a small town in central Spain. The exact circumstances of that separation from his family have not come down to us clearly, but we know that there he was raised by a local family and grew up far from his Portuguese roots. In Oropesa, the boy learned to care for cattle. He became a shepherd. The open fields, the silence of the mornings, the cold of winter and the heat of the Iberian summer were part of his formation. It was a simple, physically demanding life that taught him to observe, to wait, and to depend on something greater than his own strength. Those who know country life know that it holds a certain school of humility that no book can completely teach. The sources that have come down to us describe a restless young man, of generous spirit, but still without a clear direction. John had no great possessions, no titles, nor a set career. He had, however, a whole life ahead of him, and an energy that was seeking meaning. This restlessness was not weakness. It was, perhaps, the sign that something inside him still awaited discovery. Spain, at the beginning of the 16th century, was the scene of constant conflicts. The realm of Charles V expanded through wars in Europe and beyond, and it was common for young men without many options to find in the army a form of livelihood and adventure. Soldiers were recruited from the poorest regions, from the fields and roads, and many left without fully understanding where they were going or what they would face. John reached adulthood in an environment where military service seemed a natural path for one who was strong, without close family, and without a fixed trade. Around him, other young men had already followed that path. The battles were distant, but their consequences came close, in the faces of those who returned, in the stories that circulated through the villages, in the silence of those who never returned. It was in this context that John Ciudad made a decision that would change the coming years of his life. He decided to enlist as a soldier. We do not know everything that went through his mind at that moment. Perhaps it was the search to belong somewhere. Perhaps it was simply the need to survive. Perhaps it was that restlessness that had not yet found an answer. The young shepherd from Oropesa prepared to march. He left behind the fields, the cattle, the known routine. Ahead, there was a long and hard road, full of dangers and experiences he could not yet imagine. But there was also, waiting at some point along that road, the encounter with that which would completely transform his life and touch the hearts of thousands of people over the centuries. The life of a soldier was not glorious as in stories. It was mud, cold, obedience to orders, and living with the weight of everything that happened on the battlefield. The Vatican's official source confirms that he participated in 2 important wars. The first was in Fuenterrabia, in northern Spain, a confrontation that demanded courage and cost much from those who were there. The second took him even farther, to Vienna, where the Christian armies faced the Turks in one of the most tense battles of the time. John saw up close what war does to men. We do not need to invent details to understand that this period left marks. Any young man who spends years in an environment of violence, constant fear, and hard choices comes out different from how he went in. John was not made of iron. He lived through temptations, took paths he later regretted, and came to know a version of himself he perhaps did not expect to find. The soldier's world was harsh, and he was inside it. When the campaign ended and he could return, news arrived that hurt in a way different from any battle. His mother had died. Too soon. While he was away, she had gone without his being able to say goodbye. This kind of loss stays inside us and changes something forever. John returned to Oropesa, to the place where he had grown up far from her. Then he went on as best he could, doing what he knew how to do, tending sheep, working in various trades, serving where there was need. Life had no clear direction. He was a man who lived one day at a time, not really knowing where he was headed. At a certain moment, he learned of a Portuguese family that had been expelled from North Africa and was without resources, without a home, without protection. John went to help them. That gesture was not anyone's plan. It simply happened because he felt it was necessary. And when he learned that there were Christian captives in those regions, a desire arose in him to rescue them, to do something great and brave. But that desire was not realized. Circumstances did not allow it. John had to accept yet another door that did not open. He passed through Gibraltar. He worked. He kept searching. Sometimes an adult's life seems like a series of attempts that don't reach where one hoped, and John knew that feeling well. He was not a ready-made saint, molded since childhood with a clear mission in his head. He was an ordinary man, with real flaws, with a complicated past, with a heart that still did not quite know what it was seeking. It was in Gibraltar, or near there, that he began to sell books and religious images. It was simple work, with a small profit margin, but it was honest. He carried with him figures of saints, prayer texts, small devotional objects. Curiously, this man, who had spent years in a world of war, was now distributing words about God. The contrast was not a coincidence. It was the beginning of something he still could not name. Have you ever wondered what happens when a person looks back and feels that they wasted years of their life? Who took wrong paths? Who lost time? Who was not who they should have been? It is a huge weight, but sometimes it is precisely that weight that prepares the heart for a true change, one that does not pass, one that transforms everything. John was over 40 years old when he arrived in Granada. He was not young. He had scars that did not show on his skin. He had lived through wars, losses, mistakes, and long years of searching without a certain destination. But he also had something that no experience could erase, a sensitivity to the suffering of others that remained alive within him, even when everything else seemed confused. In Granada, he continued his small activity of selling books and religious images. It was a lively city, full of different people, of crossing stories, of poor and rich sharing the same streets. John watched everything. And on a day he did not yet know would be different from all the others, he went to listen to a preacher. The name of that preacher was John of Avila. That year, a famous preacher came to Granada. His name was John of Avila, a priest of burning faith, known for the depth of his words and his ability to touch people's hearts. Saint John of God went to hear him, like so many other townspeople, and what happened in that sermon changed his life forever, from the inside out. John of Avila's words reached something very deep in Saint John of God's heart. An old pain, a weight of choices he had made over the years, the feeling that he had wasted precious time away from God, all of that surfaced at once. The impact was immense. Saint John of God left shaken with repentance and love, in a state of very intense inner emotion. Driven by that turmoil, Saint John of God walked the streets in public penance, voicing his pain and his desire to change. To those watching from the outside, not understanding what was happening inside him, it looked like madness. The people of Granada were confused and alarmed. Saint John of God was taken in and brought to the Royal Hospital, where people considered out of their minds were kept. What he found inside was something he would never forget. In the Royal Hospital, people who suffered mental disturbances were treated in ways we now recognize as cruel and inhumane. These were common methods at the time, but that did not make them less painful. Isolation, chains, forced treatments. That was how 16th century society understood care for those who suffered in mind and spirit. Saint John of God experienced that reality from the inside, not as an observer, but as someone subjected to those conditions. And in that difficult place, something very important happened. He learned, in his own skin, what it means to be treated without dignity. He felt the weight of being seen not as a person, but as a problem to be contained. That experience left a deep and transforming mark on his heart. It was also at the Royal Hospital that John of Avila visited him. The preacher realized that this man had not lost his mind. He had found God in an overwhelming way and needed guidance, not chains. With wisdom and patience, John of Avila helped him find a way to channel all that love and all that pain into something concrete, useful, true. When he left the Royal Hospital, Saint John of God was a different man. Not in the sense that he had forgotten what he had felt, but in the sense that he had found a direction. Early biographies tell that he clearly expressed the desire that had been born in him. He wanted a hospital, a place where abandoned poor people, sick people without resources, and those considered without judgment could be welcomed with real care, with respect, with humanity. Under the firm and loving guidance of John of Avila, Saint John of God began a path of preparation. Good intentions were not enough. He needed to learn. John of Avila directed him so that, before opening his own doors, he would know how to care for a true patient with his hands, with knowledge, with constant presence. Saint John of God then set out on pilgrimage to Guadalupe, a town marked by devotion and Christian tradition. There stood the General Hospital of the Hieronymites, one of the most respected places of the time for caring for the sick. He was received there not as a guest, but as an apprentice. He watched, helped, and learned from those who knew. Every dressing, every care, every moment of attention to the sick was also a prayer. In that hospital, Saint John of God trained his hands and his heart at the same time. He learned that caring is an art that requires both skill and presence. A patient does not need only medicine, but someone to look them in the eye and treat them as a person. True hospitality does not live in distant gestures. It happens up close, in the humble daily work of service. When Saint John of God returned to Granada, he came back transformed. He carried with him what he had learned at the Hieronymites, the spiritual guidance of John of Avila, and the living memory of what he had suffered in the Royal Hospital. He also carried a question that would not leave him, and that had become the center of his life. How to welcome those whom no one wants to welcome. How to make the most forgotten, the most discarded, the most confused and fragile find not only a roof, but a human face that would receive them with love. Saint John of God returned to Granada's streets with a changed heart, but with his feet on the ground. He knew the city inch by inch. He knew where the ruthless slept, where those ashamed to beg hid, where the abandoned were left whom no one wanted to visit. And it was precisely to those places that he went every day, without exception, with open arms and attentive eyes. He begged in the squares, knocked on doors, stopped passers-by and asked for alms. Not for himself, but for those who could not ask. There were those who could not get out of bed, those who were afraid to ask for help, those who believed they deserved nothing. For them, Saint John of God asked. He became the voice of those who had lost their voice, and the arm of those who had lost their strength. With what he collected, and with the help of some people of goodwill, between 1538 and 1539, Saint John of God founded in Granada what he called the House of God, his first hospital. It was a simple place, without pomp, but with something missing in nearly every hospital of the time: the certainty that each person inside really mattered and deserved to be treated with care and respect. One of the innovations he introduced seemed small, but it meant everything. Each patient had his or her own bed. At that time, it was common for different sick people to share the same bed, with no separation, mixed without care. Saint John of God changed that. He understood that dignity begins in concrete details, and that an individual bed was a sign that that person had a name, a story, a value. But it was not only the bed. Saint John of God sought to understand the kind of illness each person had, so he could offer the appropriate care. Some needed special food, some needed silence, some needed conversation, some suffered in the body and also in the soul, carrying old hurts and years of loneliness. He attended to all of that: the body, hygiene, food, comfort, company, and faith. He welcomed everyone: nameless poor people, sick people without family, those society had pushed to the margins of life. Among those who arrived at the House of God were women living on the streets with no protection, men consumed by shameful illnesses, children with no one. Saint John of God did not ask whether a person deserved help. For him, it was enough that they were in need. It was at this time that the name by which we still know him appeared. The people of Granada, seeing that singular man who lived entirely for God and for the poor, began to call him John of God. It was a name that said who he was, someone who belonged to God, and therefore also belonged to every brother and sister he met on the way. In 1539, the Archbishop of Granada formally recognized his mission and gave him a habit, visibly marking the call Saint John of God had already been living for some time. It was as if the church spoke aloud what John's heart had already known in silence, that life of service had a sacred meaning and deserved to be honored. When he went out into the streets to ask for alms for his sick, Saint John of God used to repeat an appeal that stayed in the memory of those who heard him. He called people to help with words that sounded like a generous invitation: do good to yourselves. The idea was simple and beautiful. Who opens their hand to help someone also does good to their own heart. Kindness does not make the giver poorer. It enriches them within. It was an invitation to discover that caring for another is also a way of caring for oneself. Little by little, Saint John of God was no longer alone. Men touched by his example began to appear, wanting to help, wanting to learn, wanting to take part in that work. Tradition tells that among those first collaborators were some who in the past had been his enemies, people who had mistreated or scorned him, and who were later converted by the beauty of that service and became his most devoted companions. It is a detail that says a great deal about what true kindness is capable of doing. The House of God grew quietly, day after day, full of people the city had forgotten, and who now found a place where they were seen, heard, and cared for. Saint John of God did not found a distant charity service where the rich gave to the poor without coming close. He founded a place of encounter, where each person's dignity was recognized up close, with hands, with time, with presence. It was on a night like so many others that Saint John of God looked up and saw, in the distance, Granada's sky stained with an uneasy orange glow. The Royal Hospital, that same place where he had suffered and where his purpose had matured, was on fire. And Saint John of God was already running toward the blaze. Granada was sleeping under the cold of night when cries tore the silence. The Royal Hospital was on fire. The flames consumed the wooden roof, and thick smoke filled the corridors where sick men and women, many bedridden and helpless, could not escape on their own. Saint John of God was nearby when the alarm sounded. Catholic sources and general references record that he took part in the rescue that night, running toward the burning building. The established tradition, preserved by early biographies and repeated by generations of devotees, recounts that Saint John of God entered the burning building more than once, carrying patients unable to walk, guiding those who still had strength toward the exits, not resting while anyone remained inside. According to the same account, he climbed onto the roof and, with great effort, separated a wing that threatened to spread the fire. The tradition adds that, in the end, he emerged unharmed. What matters to understand, however, is the heart of that gesture. Saint John of God did not run toward the fire to prove his bravery or to be admired. He ran because he knew there were people inside who depended on someone. People whom no one else claimed. Sick people the city barely knew by name. To Saint John of God, each one had a face, a dignity, a worth that no flame could erase. It was that love that moved his steps, not a desire for adventure. It is because of that self-giving in coming to the aid of others that the church and popular devotion venerate him as the patron saint of firefighters, men and women who also run toward danger to save lives. In Saint John of God, they recognize someone who lived, before any title, what they themselves choose to do with their lives every day. If this story touched you, how about pressing the subscribe button and leaving a like? That way more people can get to know the saints who shaped the world with love. After the night of the fire, Saint John of God's life continued to be made up of small gestures and steady presence. While his helpers slept, he would spend hours in silent prayer. Those who lived with him could see that service did not dry him up inside, because it was fed by something that came from God. He did not separate caring for others from intimacy with the Creator. For Saint John of God, washing a poor man's feet was also a form of prayer. At the same time, he had learned from his own experience that charity needs wisdom. It was not enough to want to help. One had to help well, with attention, with organization, with respect. That is how he built his hospital with care. Individual beds, separation of the sick by type of disease, continuous care. Such attention, in the 16th century, was rare and precious. Around Saint John of God, a small community began to grow. Doctors who admired his method came to collaborate. Priests accompanied the dying and brought the sacraments. Benefactors from the city, touched by the witness of that man who had no riches but was full of generosity, began to support the work with donations. The house of God ceased to be a solitary effort and became something greater than one man could build. The old biographies also tell of devotional traditions that the faithful cherish. One of them says that Saint Raphael the Archangel, the angel of healing who guides and protects the sick, accompanied Saint John of God in his acts of hospitality, guiding his steps in service to the ill. Another tradition says that the child Jesus himself appeared to Saint John of God, taking on the face of a poor person he carried in his arms. These are devotional accounts, not verifiable historical records, but they express the deep faith that God was present in that service in a very real way. Saint John of God reached the age of 55, carrying on his body the weight of decades of tireless work. Granada knew him well. He was the man who walked the streets calling for benefactors and cared for the poor, with a dedication that did not diminish, even when his own strength began to fail. One day of flooding, when the Genil River overflowed and the current swept everything away, Saint John of God heard a cry for help. Sources differ in the details, but they agree on the essential point. He went toward the water. There was a person in danger, and Saint John of God could not stand aside. He was the same man as ever, the same heart that had entered the hospital on fire, that had carried the sick on his shoulders, that had seen Christ in the faces of the marginalized. And so, once again, he went. Saint John of God entered the water in an effort to rescue someone in danger. The details vary according to each account, but all the biographies agree that this heroic effort left him gravely ill. There is no doubt that he acted out of love. He never learned to stand still when someone needed help. But the effort took its toll. He contracted a severe respiratory illness that forced him, for the first time in so many years, to give up work and lie in bed. He who had always cared for others now needed to be cared for. And there was something beautiful and human in that reversal. The hospital received back the one who had founded it. Saint John of God became ill with the same simplicity with which he had lived. He worried about the debts he had incurred to support the poor, and he asked friends to make sure no one would be left without help after his passing. He did not think of himself. Even weakened, his attention remained on others, on those who depended on that house he had built with so much sacrifice and love. Tradition says that, in his final moments, Saint John of God rose from his bed, walked to the crucifix he kept in his room and died on his knees before it, in silent prayer. This image, preserved by the old biographies, says much about who he was. A man who had sought God in the face of the poor, and who at the end found the poor in the face of God. He died on March 8, 1550, exactly on the day he had been born 55 years earlier. Granada felt his absence. The whole city recognized that it had lost someone very special. Those who had lived with Saint John of God, his co-workers, those he had cared for, those he had welcomed, all knew that the work could not stop. And it did not stop. The men he had trained continued to welcome the sick, the poor, and the marginalized with the same spirit of dignity and care they had learned from him. This continuity took official form when Pope Sixtus V approved the Hospitaller Order of Saint John of God in 1586, more than 30 years after the founder's death. What had begun as the gesture of a single man with a mattress and great love had become an institution recognized by the Universal Church. Saint John of God's Spirit had grown, crossed borders, and reached places he had never set foot. The Church soon formally recognized the holiness of that Portuguese man from Montemor-o-Novo. In 1630, Pope Urban VIII declared him blessed, confirming that his life had truly been lived in the light of the gospel. 60 years later, on October 16, 1690, Pope Alexander VIII went further and canonized him, proclaiming him a saint for the whole Church. John Ciudad, the boy who had lost his home as a child, was now Saint John of God. The popes who followed continued to acknowledge the reach of his work. In 1886, Pope Leo XIII proclaimed him patron saint of hospitals and the sick. In 1930, Pius XI extended that patronage to nurses and their associations. In 1940, Pius XII declared him second patron saint of Granada, the city where he had planted his seed of hospitality. And popular devotion was even more generous. Firefighters invoke him as their patron, recalling the tradition that tells of his courageous effort during the fire at the Royal Hospital. Today, the Hospital Order of Saint John of God is present in dozens of countries, caring for thousands of people who would otherwise be without help. Every hospital, every shelter, every ward where someone is treated with respect and tenderness carries a bit of the spirit of that man who learned, when he himself was hospitalized, what it means to be sick and helpless. The hospitality he practiced was not distant charity. It was looking into the eyes of someone who suffers and recognizing there a person loved by God. The Feast of Saint John of God is celebrated on March 8, the same day he was